Welcome, this is a very calm and boring history video. The purpose of this video is not excitement. It is made for relaxation, slow learning and perhaps gentle sleep. If you are tired or if your day has been long, just keep listening. You may close your eyes. There is no hurry. In very ancient times, when the world was much slower than today, naval warfare was also very simple. Ships were made of wood. There were no engines, no fuel, no machines, only wind and human effort. Ships were moved using oars. Dozens of people would sit together and slowly row across the sea. This work was exhausting, but it was the only way to travel on water. The sea was quiet and movement was slow. Naval armament in those early days was very basic. The most common weapons were bows and arrows. Archers stood on the deck and fired arrows toward enemy ships. Sometimes spears were used, and in a few cases, small fire pots were thrown to damage wooden vessels. These weapons were not very powerful. Battles took a long time. Victory required patience. Ancient civilizations such as Greece and Rome developed special warships. These ships were called triremes. Triremes were long and narrow. They had 3 rows of oars on each side. That is where the name comes from. The main weapon of a trireme was not a gun or a cannon. It was ramming. Ramming meant striking the enemy ship directly with the front of your own vessel. At the front of the ship, but beneath that calm surface, something powerful was beginning to grow. For centuries, the oceans had been seen as vast highways, endless blue paths connecting distant lands, cultures and people. Merchants crossed these waters in search of spices, silk, gold and stories from lands unknown. Sailors spent months drifting across open seas with nothing but wind in their sails and hope in their hearts. Yet as time passed, humanity's relationship with the sea began to change. Because wherever wealth travels, power follows. And wherever power gathers, conflict is never far behind. As civilizations expanded, kings and emperors started to realize something important. Controlling land was not enough. Whoever controlled the sea could control trade routes, resources and influence across continents. The oceans were no longer just routes of travel. They had become strategic assets. And with this realization, the peaceful waters slowly began transforming into potential battlegrounds. In the earliest days of naval warfare, combat at sea was surprisingly simple. Ships were made of wood, powered by wind and human strength. There were no engines, no advanced weapons, and no heavy armor. Battles depended heavily on courage, discipline, and the sheer will to survive. Warriors stood on wooden decks with bows and arrows, throwing spears or stones at approaching enemies. When ships came close enough, soldiers would leap from one vessel to another, engaging in fierce hand-to-hand combat. It was brutal and personal, a fight where the outcome depended on strength, timing, and bravery. Among the first civilizations to truly understand naval power were the ancient Greeks. Living among scattered islands and surrounded by the Mediterranean Sea, they understood that control of water meant survival. They began developing specialized warships designed not just for travel but for battle. One of their greatest innovations was the trireme. The trireme was a sleek and narrow warship designed for speed and maneuverability. It had 3 rows of oars on each side, operated by dozens of trained rowers who worked in perfect coordination. When they rowed together, the ship could move swiftly across the water, almost like a living creature responding to commands. But the most terrifying feature of the trireme was not its speed. It was the weapon attached to its front, a heavy bronze ram. This ram was designed to pierce and destroy enemy ships. During battle, a trireme would charge toward its opponent at full speed. At just the right moment, the helmsman would steer sharply, aiming the bronze ram directly at the enemy vessel's hull. The impact was devastating. Wood would splinter, water would rush in, and within moments, the damaged ship would begin to sink. Imagine the chaos of such a battle. The sound of drums guiding the rowers, commanders shouting orders across the deck, waves crashing against wooden hulls as ships maneuvered for position. Then suddenly collision. The force of wood against metal echoed across the sea. Sailors lost balance, weapons fell, and panic spread as water flooded into broken hulls. For many, the sea itself became the final enemy, cold, deep, and unforgiving. The Romans later adopted and improved these naval strategies. As their empire expanded across the Mediterranean, they needed strong fleets to protect trade routes and maintain control over distant territories. Roman engineers began modifying ships, making them larger and more durable. They also introduced new tactics, combining naval combat with their famous infantry strength. One clever Roman invention was the corvus, a boarding bridge that could be dropped onto enemy ships. Instead of simply ramming and sinking opponents, Roman soldiers could now board enemy vessels quickly and fight using their superior training on land-style combat. It turned sea battles into floating land battles, something the Romans excelled at. With each passing century, ships grew stronger and naval tactics became more refined. Yet for a long time, battles at sea still relied mostly on physical combat and simple projectile weapons. The oceans echoed with the sounds of clashing metal, shouting warriors, and crashing waves. But far away, in another part of the world, a discovery was being made that would soon change everything. In ancient China, alchemists experimenting with different substances accidentally created a powerful mixture, gunpowder. At first, it was used for fireworks and simple explosives, but its potential as a weapon quickly became clear. As knowledge of gunpowder spread across continents through trade and conquest, it eventually reached Europe and the Middle East. And when it did, naval warfare entered a new era. Cannons began appearing on ships. At first, they were small and unreliable, but over time they became larger, stronger, and far more destructive. Now battles at sea were no longer fought only with arrows and swords. Ships could attack each other from a distance, firing heavy cannonballs capable of smashing through wooden hulls. The calm silence of the ocean was replaced by thunderous explosions. Smoke filled the air, and the once peaceful sea transformed into a battlefield of fire and chaos. The introduction of cannons changed ship design forever. Vessels had to be built stronger to carry heavy weapons. Decks were reinforced. Gun ports were added along the sides of ships, allowing multiple cannons to fire at once. These powerful warships became floating fortresses, capable of both defending and attacking with incredible force. With these advancements, naval power became one of the most important symbols of an empire's strength. Nations began investing heavily in building fleets. Whoever commanded the strongest navy could protect trade routes, expand territories, and project power across the globe. The oceans were no longer just pathways of discovery and trade. They had become arenas of strategy, technology, and dominance. From simple wooden boats carrying brave warriors, to massive cannon-equipped warships capable of destroying entire fleets. The evolution of naval armament had truly begun. And this transformation was only the beginning, because as technology continued to advance, the ships of the future would become faster, stronger, and more powerful than anyone in the ancient world could have ever imagined. Would you like me to continue this story into the age of steam and steel, or perhaps explore the rise of submarines? The transformation did not happen overnight. It came slowly, quietly, like the tide itself. As centuries passed, wooden ships that once relied only on wind and manpower began to evolve into something far more complex. Shipbuilders experimented with stronger designs, thicker hulls, and improved navigation techniques. The ocean was no longer seen as an unpredictable mystery alone. It was becoming a controlled pathway for empires seeking expansion and dominance. During the late medieval period, Europe entered an age of exploration. Powerful kingdoms such as Spain, Portugal, England, and France began sending fleets across the oceans in search of new lands and resources. These voyages were not just about discovery, they were also about control. Whoever ruled the seas could influence trade, wealth, and power across continents. As trade routes expanded, so did the need to protect them. Merchant ships carrying gold, silver, spices, and valuable goods became targets for pirates and rival nations. To defend these floating treasures, ships had to be armed more heavily than ever before. Cannons became a permanent feature on naval vessels, changing the very nature of sea travel. Early naval cannons were crude but effective. Made of heavy iron or bronze, they were capable of firing solid cannonballs that could smash through wooden hulls with terrifying force. Loading these cannons was a slow and dangerous process. Sailors had to carefully measure gunpowder, insert the cannonball, and ignite the charge while the ship rocked with the motion of the waves. One mistake could lead to disaster. Yet despite the risks, cannons quickly proved their value. A single well-placed shot could disable an enemy ship, break its mast, or create holes below the waterline. Battles that once required close combat could now begin from a distance. Ships lined up side by side, firing volleys of cannon fire in coordinated attacks. The thunder of these cannons echoed across the sea, accompanied by thick clouds of smoke that drifted over the water. This era saw the rise of famous warships known as ships of the line. These massive sailing vessels were designed specifically for naval combat. They carried rows of cannons along their sides, sometimes numbering more than 50 or even 100 guns. Built from strong timber and reinforced with iron fittings, they were floating fortresses capable of withstanding heavy damage. Life aboard these warships was disciplined and demanding. Sailors worked long hours maintaining sails, cleaning decks, and preparing weapons. Every crew member had a specific role during battle. Some loaded cannons, others managed ropes and sails, while officers gave commands that echoed across the deck. Coordination was essential. A single mistake during combat could cost an entire ship its survival. When two fleets met in battle, the scene was both majestic and terrifying. Lines of towering ships approached each other slowly, their sails full and cannons ready. As they drew closer, commanders gave the signal to fire. In an instant, the calm ocean erupted into chaos. Cannonballs flew through the air, smashing into wood and sending splinters flying. The smell of gunpowder filled the air as smoke covered the battlefield. Despite the violence, naval battles during this time also required patience and strategy. Wind direction played a crucial role. A fleet positioned correctly with the wind at its back had a major advantage. Skilled captains used maneuvering tactics to outsmart opponents, attempting to position their ships for maximum firepower while avoiding enemy volleys. But even these powerful sailing warships had limitations. They depended entirely on wind. If the wind stopped, so did they. During calm weather, ships could become stranded in open water, unable to move or fight effectively. This limitation pushed inventors and engineers to search for new ways to power vessels across the sea. The answer would arrive in the form of steam. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the Industrial Revolution was transforming industries across the world. Steam engines, first used in factories and locomotives, began finding their way onto ships. Early steam-powered vessels still used sails, but they also featured paddle wheels or propellers driven by engines. For the first time in history, ships could move without relying entirely on wind. This innovation changed naval warfare forever. Steam-powered ships could travel faster and maintain consistent speed regardless of weather conditions. They could maneuver more precisely during battle, giving them a significant advantage over traditional sailing vessels. Nations quickly realized the potential of steam technology and began investing in modern fleets powered by engines instead of sails. At the same time, another revolutionary change was taking place. Wooden hulls that had dominated shipbuilding for centuries were gradually replaced with iron and steel. These new materials offered greater durability and protection against enemy fire. Cannonballs that once shattered wooden ships now struggled to penetrate armored hulls. The first ironclad warships appeared in the mid-19th century. Covered in thick metal plating, they represented a dramatic shift in naval design. Battles between ironclads demonstrated that traditional wooden fleets were becoming obsolete. The age of armored warships had begun. As technology continued to advance, naval weapons also evolved. Cannons became more accurate and powerful. Explosive shells replaced solid cannonballs, increasing destructive capability. Ships grew larger and more complex, equipped with advanced navigation systems and communication tools. The oceans, once dominated by simple wooden vessels and hand-to-hand combat, were now filled with mechanical giants powered by steam and protected by iron. Naval warfare had transformed into a contest of engineering, industry, and technological innovation. And yet, this was still only the beginning, because the 20th century would soon arrive, bringing with it two global conflicts that would push naval technology further than ever before. Battleships larger than entire city blocks, silent submarines moving beneath the waves, and aircraft carriers capable of launching planes across vast distances would redefine what it meant to control the sea. The evolution of naval armament was far from over. Would you like me to dive into the specifics of the World War era battleships, or perhaps discuss the strategic shift toward aircraft carriers? As the new century began, the world stood on the edge of rapid industrial and technological change. Factories expanded, engines became more powerful, and nations competed not only for land, but for dominance over the oceans. Naval power was no longer just a symbol of strength. It had become a necessity for survival in a world growing more connected and more competitive with each passing year. At the dawn of the 20th century, one type of warship captured the imagination of military leaders across the globe. These were the dreadnoughts, massive battleships designed with a single purpose: overwhelming firepower. Built with steel hulls, powerful steam turbines, and rows of enormous naval guns, dreadnoughts represented the peak of naval engineering at the time. Unlike earlier ships that carried a mixture of small and large cannons, dreadnoughts were equipped primarily with heavy guns of the same size. This allowed them to fire long-range salvos with greater accuracy and devastating impact. Their thick armor made them difficult to destroy, and their size alone was enough to inspire both pride and fear. Nations raced to build these floating giants, believing that the strength of their navy would determine their place in global power. When the First World War began in 1914, these powerful fleets were ready. Across the oceans, Massive warships patrolled strategic routes, protecting supply lines and preparing for potential confrontation. Although many expected dramatic clashes between battleships, much of the naval conflict during this war took a different form. One that was quiet, hidden, and deeply unsettling. This new threat came from beneath the surface. Submarines, once considered experimental and unreliable, had evolved into effective weapons of war. Early submarines were small and cramped, powered by engines that allowed them to travel both on the surface and underwater for limited periods. They moved slowly compared to surface ships, but they possessed one crucial advantage: stealth. Hidden beneath the waves, submarines could approach enemy vessels without being seen. Armed with torpedoes, self-propelled underwater explosives, they could strike suddenly and disappear into the depths before anyone realized what had happened. Merchant ships carrying supplies became frequent targets. Even large warships were vulnerable if caught off guard. The presence of submarines changed the psychology of naval warfare. Sailors traveling across the ocean knew that danger could be lurking anywhere below them. The sea, once an open and visible battlefield, had become unpredictable and tense. Convoys and escort ships were introduced to protect valuable cargo, and new detection methods were developed in an attempt to locate these hidden threats. While submarines operated silently below the surface, battleships and cruisers continued to dominate above. Naval engagements during the First World War demonstrated both the power and the limitations of these enormous vessels. They were heavily armed and armored, yet also expensive and complex to build. Losing even one could significantly impact a nation's naval strength. As the war eventually came to an end, many believed that naval technology had reached its peak. But history had other plans. Only a few decades later, the world would once again find itself in conflict, and this time, the oceans would witness an even greater transformation. The Second World War began in 1939, and with it came a new era of innovation and urgency. Nations invested heavily in research and development, seeking any advantage that could turn the tide of battle. Naval forces were expanded and modernized, incorporating lessons learned from previous conflicts. Among the most significant developments of this era was the rise of the aircraft carrier. At first, aircraft carriers were seen as support vessels, ships designed to transport and launch reconnaissance planes. But as aviation technology improved, their potential became clear. Aircraft could travel faster and farther than any ship, delivering bombs and torpedoes with remarkable precision. A fleet equipped with carriers could strike targets far beyond the visible horizon. These carriers functioned as floating air bases. Their long flight decks allowed planes to take off and land even in the middle of the ocean. Inside, they carried fuel, ammunition, and maintenance facilities needed to support entire squadrons. Protected by escort ships and armed with defensive weapons, aircraft carriers soon became the centerpiece of modern naval strategy. Battles that once relied on direct ship-to-ship combat now often depended on air power. Fleets could engage each other without ever coming into visual range. Planes launched from carriers searched for enemy positions, delivered attacks, and returned to their decks, all while ships remained miles apart. Control of the sky above the ocean became just as important as control of the water itself. Submarines also played a crucial role during this period. Improved designs allowed them to travel longer distances and remain underwater for extended periods. They targeted supply routes, attempting to disrupt the flow of resources needed to sustain war efforts. In response, navies developed sonar systems and depth charges to detect and counter underwater threats. A constant game of strategy unfolded beneath the waves. By the end of the Second World War, naval warfare had transformed beyond recognition. The dominance of traditional battleships began to fade, replaced by more versatile and technologically advanced vessels. Aircraft carriers, submarines, and fast escort ships formed complex fleets capable of operating across vast distances. Yet, technological progress did not stop with the end of the war. In the decades that followed, rapid scientific advancements introduced entirely new possibilities. Radar systems improved detection and navigation. Guided missiles replaced many traditional naval guns, allowing ships to strike targets with unprecedented accuracy. Nuclear power made it possible for submarines and carriers to operate for months without refueling, extending their reach across the globe. Modern naval vessels became highly sophisticated machines, equipped with advanced communication systems, electronic sensors, and automated weaponry. Crews relied not only on strength and skill but also on technology and coordination. The ocean, once a place of simple wooden ships and manual combat, had become a domain of complex engineering and strategic precision. Today, the evolution of naval armament continues. Nations invest in stealth technology, unmanned vessels, and defensive systems capable of intercepting incoming threats. Aircraft carriers remain symbols of national strength, while submarines patrol silently beneath the waves. Each innovation builds upon centuries of experimentation and experience, from ancient oars and bronze rams to ironclads, dreadnoughts, and nuclear-powered fleets. The journey of naval development reflects humanity's constant drive to explore, protect, and dominate the seas. And as technology continues to move forward, the future of naval warfare remains both fascinating and uncertain. The oceans are still vast, still powerful. Would you